been speaking out a lot about Black Lives Matter, about Antifa, about their rhetoric, about their conduct. What is driving you right now?
Thank you very much for having me, Mark. And, you know, I have 30 years invested as a civil rights attorney, public school teacher, as you mentioned, and I'm frustrated and disappointed in the Democratic Party and the left. I mean, it really started a couple of weeks ago when Joe Biden made that comment, that awful comment, that insulting comment that if you vote Republican, you ain't black. I'm a civil rights attorney. That statement was condescending and insulted every African American, every American. And then you follow up with a series of protesting, which is perfectly okay. But the failure of the Democratic Party to call out the rioting, the looting, the murder, it's just something that I, as a civil rights attorney, could no longer sit and just basically stay quiet. And then you have the ultimate insult of talking about defunding the police. I want everyone to know that I have a sister in law enforcement. And I may criticize bad police officers because, Mark, 97, 98% of the officers are great. They protect you and I at 2 and 3 in the morning. And 2 or 3%, like the George Floyd situation, horrible. But my goodness, to defund the police, to take away law and order, and then you have this unbelievable situation where the Democrats will not criticize Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is disingenuous. Why? Because there's only certain black lives that they care about. What about that retired black officer, David Dorn? Black man, murdered, defending a business. I didn't see black lives there. I didn't see Al Sharpton there. It's certain blacks that they care about to profiteer the black community. Where's the Democratic leadership? Calling out the protesters. They're fine, but never criticizing the looters. Never criticizing those who are burning property. That drives me nuts. And then what I cannot understand is when there's an opportunity to do legitimate police reform, when you have a great South Carolinian Senator, Tim Scott, working his butt off 24/7 to get justice reform, and the Democrats will not work with him because they don't want the perception that the Republicans are working on police reform. And finally, Mark, you know what? People may criticize the president, but what American doesn't want law and order? I do. President Trump does. And here's a man with an executive order accomplished more with a stroke of a pen regarding police reform, creating a database, than what the Obama and Biden administration have done in 8 years. That is why I am being consistent. That is why I am speaking out. I have credibility to speak out, and I will continue to speak out on these issues that I've just raised.
So, Leo Terrell, you talk about Black Lives Matter. You also have this Antifa movement. I've looked into the backgrounds of these organizations. They really are Marxist anarchist organizations, much like the Weather Underground of the 1960s. The two co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement have said they are trained Marxists. They also were supporters of the Bernie Sanders campaign. We don't hear Bernie Sanders speaking out. We don't hear Biden speaking out, Pelosi. We don't hear Schumer speaking out. More to your point, do you think now that this very radical element, which does not represent the vast majority of Americans, does not represent the vast majority of African Americans, they're not up for a vote, they just claim to. Do you think this is a growing element within the Democrat Party? You think that's why the leadership of the Democrat Party is giving silent approval, really, to what they're doing?
You know, Mark, I think Black Lives Matter have dominated social media. But the perception is that they control the Democratic Party. I'm hoping, I'm begging, I'm praying that they don't control the Democratic Party. But the current status right now, it is. It has controlled the Democratic Party. It has muted Democratic leadership. The Democratic leadership is afraid of Black Lives Matter for a variety of reasons. One is the most insulting. They assume they speak for African Americans. Let me be clear. Black Lives Matter does not speak for Leo Terrell. And there is no representative, there's no monolithic group like Black Lives Matter that speak for African Americans. We are individuals and we have our own individual opinion. I can assure you Those African Americans in these democratic cities, they want law and order. That's the goalpost, police. The goalpost between the criminal and a safe neighborhood. But what Black Lives have done is they have hijacked the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has remained silent, fearing that they will alienate mainstream blacks. Trust me, Democratic leadership, you won't alienate mainstream black voters. But the Black Lives leadership has controlled the platform for the Democratic Party as we speak.
You know, you talked about the fact that Black Lives Matter doesn't seem to care much about Mr. Dorn, who was really murdered in cold blood. A wonderful man, by all accounts, and others, by the way, white, black, interracial. In other words, they push a narrative. You've got going on in our cities today, particularly when you look at cities like Chicago, absolute slaughter taking place. The number of people who were shot, you had a one weekend not long ago where over 100 people were shot, 15 people killed, 5 of which were little kids, one of which was a 3-year-old. I don't hear a thing, by the way, I don't hear a thing other than a passing reference by the mainstream media. Oh, look, isn't this horrible? Now back at Trump. Or Black Lives Matter. I don't hear people marching about this. I don't even see Sharpton marching about this. This is, I mean, when you look at that little 3-year-old kid who is sitting in the car, or that 13-year-old girl who was sitting watching TV, a bullet went through her neck. At 16 and 17-year-old kids, boys who are out behaving, having a good time, somebody walks up and murders them, and it's like nobody knows their name. It just moves on, and that's the end of it, and let's get back to the cops. I don't understand the mindset of these organizations. Shouldn't you be in these neighborhoods marching for protection? And there are, by the way, there are pastors, there are anti-crime individuals, but their voices aren't heard. It's just it's the mob. The mob's voice is heard. What do you think of that?
Now, I'll tell you, you hit it right on the head. Here's the problem. This is why Black Lives Matter. It's basically, in my opinion, the Al Sharpton of the 21st century. They're profiteers. They are profiting on trying to give a narrative, a false narrative, that is white racist cops that's destroying the black community. You point out Chicago. No Black Lives presence walking through the neighborhood protesting to stop black on black crime. Al Sharpton goes to the George Floyd funeral, used a funeral to launch a campaign speech attacking Donald Trump. I don't see Al Sharpton in Chicago. That 3-year-old kid who was killed. You know why? Because it's not profitable. There's no money to be made. And this narrative, which is, you know, and again, I have the credibility. Attack me. As a civil rights attorney, I know there may be 1 or 2% of bad cops. But 98%, they're great. And when you talk about Chicago, you talk about Atlanta, you talk about Washington, D.C., and it's live, Mark, of systemic discrimination. How can you have systemic discrimination in Chicago when the leadership is minority? I know what systemic discrimination is. It does not exist. But yet, this is the narrative that the Black Lives leadership portrays, the Democratic leadership, systemic discrimination. It doesn't exist. They don't know what they're talking about. This is not 1960. We don't have Bull Connor and the German Shepherds. This is 2020. I'm African American on your show. It's not like it was 50 years ago. But Black Lives Matter and the Democratic leadership wants you to think it's 1960. Well, I'm sick of that narrative.
And Leo, the Democrat Party doesn't have any answers. The Democrat Party runs these cities with an iron fist. It's one-party rule. All the money from the feds and the states and the local tax base flow through their hands. They choose the people for these highest positions, even police chiefs. The prosecutors are locally elected. They do not support school choice. They're in bed with these public sector unions. They don't introduce free market principles where people can be encouraged to make profits, to invest. All these things that the rest of the country does is not happening in our inner cities. And it's not because people are minorities. It's because you've got iron-fisted one-party rule that will not introduce true reform. It doesn't have a liberty agenda. It has a Democrat Party agenda. Does that make sense to you?
Oh yeah, and the most important question that I learned in law school is why? Why do they do that? And I've been trying to figure it out, and I know why. It's pandering. It is their power base, Mark. They want their constituents, their constituents to believe that the Democratic Party and the government has to do everything. It's the only way they can stay in power. They don't want charter school. They don't want choice. They don't want people of color to think for themselves, to work and make their own career choice. They want the government to hand out things. They want their constituents to believe that the government is everything for them. Well, I won't drink that Kool-Aid anymore, because choice, opportunity to make personal decisions has to take place for people of color, for anyone in this country, to move up. I made personal decisions to go to law school, to become a school teacher, to work. And I will no longer buy the rhetoric by Democrats to make the assumption that only government, Mark, only government can help you out, no one else. I refute and reject that premise.
And you know, the irony, Leo, is if you want to burn the system down, they are the system. They are the system in the inner cities, in these blue areas. And they want to make the system bigger and more powerful and more centralized, where people's independence, their liberty, their ability of free will is crushed. So on the one hand, they talk about the system. Well, they own the system. And on the other hand, they talk about burning it down. When we come back, I want to ask you, Leo Terrell, what kind of reaction are you getting among friends and colleagues that you've worked with in the past, since you're such an outspoken defender of justice and equality and order? We'll be right back.